Lessons in Excellence is presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with Island FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.
If necessity is the mother of invention, invention is the mother of all new markets. This is the new model of today's markets: innovate or die.
लाइफ हो तो ऐसी कोका-कोला।
Jag, let's sort of go back to school on this one and look at how competitive markets begin their evolution. And you sort of to quote you from the book, you've said the starting point for a new market is almost always a new technology.
Right.
So a new technology comes in, a new need, a new product, and a new market.
Yeah. What happens is that we have lots of unmet needs which consumers or customers are doing on their own. There is no commercial market. A technology comes about that does it cheaper, faster, better than what we can do otherwise, and that starts a new industry. Think about cellular industry. We always had a need for mobility, even in India. But till the technology came along, nobody understood that very well. By the way, the early forecast, when I worked on that industry in 83, 84, early forecast by Bell Labs and McKinsey was that there will be only 800,000 subscribers by the year 2000. Think about how bad forecast was, how conservative the forecast was.
Amazing, isn't it?
It was targeted for the business-to-business market, a wrong target altogether. Doctors and lawyers who are traveling around kind of a thing. But today, all of a sudden, people cannot live without it.
So the originators of that technology which created this booming market of cellular technology read it all wrong.
Absolutely.
Does this happen very often?
All the time.
All the time.
All the time. In fact, we find that often a technology is constantly in search of markets, and they don't discover markets, markets discover the technology. Again and again we find
happened to the internet as well, didn't it?
Happened to the internet, exactly right. And by the way, we wrote a great article, Raj and I, in fact, on this iridium as a technology, which failed miserably because it was designed for one purpose and they tried to market some other place. They're going back to the marketing for security and very like this reporters out in Iraq kind of stuff.
That's a specialist, right?
That's a specialist,
Who
exactly.
Who tried to be a full-line journalist.
Right.
Wonderful. I've learned as well on the show. Raj, another line from the book, and that's related to what we're discussing right now. Although early entrants can specialize in different ways, almost all tend to be product specialists. Why? I mean, you're saying markets start with technology, but almost all the early companies tend to be product specialists.
That's right. First of all, the consumers are relatively new to that product category, so they haven't yet developed distinctive needs. There's a sort of at the basic need level. There's a basic need that has to be met, so different people meet it in different ways, using different kinds of approaches.
So let's carry on with the cellular example. The first cellular companies, you would say, tend to be product specialists? How would you link the two?
The first cellular companies were all basically providing the same service to everybody. Right? I mean, this was the basic service. This was the handset. This was, they did not even have differentiated service plans, etc. It was only later on that we started to see companies like Nextel in the US that came in and basically targeted only the business market, or somebody else that came in. In the UK there was a lot of activity because they had about 40 or 50 different companies that were doing the marketing, and they had a duopoly on the network. And many of these companies decided to go after certain specialty markets like doctors or plumbers, etc.
So almost always, here is a new technology, here comes a product, here comes a market, and then that market begins to evolve and get new features. Any other examples besides cellular, Jack? Something from India?
For example, there are three ways markets evolve actually.
Right.
Technology is the biggest one, but sometimes it's a make versus buy decision. When people do a lot of outsourcing, for example, the biggest event now in the US especially is in the business world, outsourcing functions.
Right.
Which is why we have the huge growth in India about the BPO market, as we call it, right? Began with call centers and now it's everything. One of the largest opportunities in India emerging is this will become the world laboratory for fundamental research.
Now this, you're saying, is not a technology driven market. No. What drove this market?
In this case it was primarily the economics of doing it yourselves versus doing it outside, outsourcing.
So a cost differential?
Cost differential, but and timing. That you may not have speed to market, may not happen if you do it inside, so quite often giving it out to somebody else, you can speed up the process in R&D, that's very key.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with ILNFS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with ILNFS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.
A new technology creates a new consumer need, and that creates a new market. Early companies are product specialists who satisfy a very basic consumer need. For example, the invention of cellular telephony created the market for mobile handsets. The first service providers gave the same basic service to everybody. As the market expanded, players like Nextel began to differentiate their service, targeting business customers. As in cellular telephony, so with almost every young market. They have low technical standards, they are easy to enter, they have a local geographical focus, and an early rush of players create excess capacity.
What I found very interesting when I was reading, you've given certain features and certain sort of features of young markets. You said they always tend to evolve, they have few technical standards, they have low barriers to entry, they have local geographical focus. One can relate a lot of these things actually to newer markets which are opening up in India, cellular, broadcast.
Correct.
Take us through this argument. Why do young markets have these kind of features?
Most of the young markets are high growth markets, but inefficient. There are no scale economies. Each one jumps into the market.
But when you say inefficient, you mean high cost. I mean,
cost.
It's not inefficient in the grammatical sense of the word, but more in the economic sense.
In economic sense, exactly right. And therefore they have a very small capacity. Each one puts small capacity. Hundreds of people jump at the same time. You have actually excess capacity in the process. This is exactly what has happened in the international call center in India. Everybody jumped into call center, we have excess capacity, and the demand has not come in as yet. Because of that efficiency issue. And the same thing, by the way, in cellular, surprisingly, we have a huge efficiency issue because we gave licenses in India region by region, city by city. First two licenses were in 4 cities, dual operators essentially. They just not scale. What's the problem for scale? It's the procurement costs. Unless you bulk yourself up, you don't have economies of scale to negotiate with a manufacturer like a Nokia, for example, or Ericsson, whoever builds those networks for you.
So younger markets tend to be high cost, inefficient markets. You've also talked about low barriers to entry. Is that a condition met by almost every industry?
Generally it is true, except if the industry itself requires high capital. start. For example, aerospace industry, there's no way you can start immediately without putting millions or billions of dollars in investment in plant capacity.
You've got some other features. You talk about few technical standards. You also
Right.
talk about local geographical focus.
Right.
Why is that? Why is that when a new technology comes in and there is a profusion of companies which come in, why do they tend to be local geographical focus?
Yes. The primary reason is that you have access to a market which is immediate, that market you can serve. Sometimes a market is existing because there is a manufacturing plant, let's say automobile guys, there's a market access immediately by and large. Then you begin to nurture that market, invest into that market, grow the market, and then you expand out from that market, from local to a national, or from a country to international essentially.
Okay. You've also talked about they tend to be vertically integrated.
Yes.
Give us an example and take us through why.
In the early days, vertical integration seems to be necessary actually to control all the way from a supply management in terms of quality assurance to making, marketing, selling, servicing, everything, because nobody else is able to do it. It's a brand new industry. Nobody knows how to do it by and large. That seems to be the pattern generally, whether you start a specialty retailing, for example, in retailing, whether you have the cell phone as we talked about. In fact, in telecom, now we are saying vertical integration is bad. It's more mature in other parts of the world. You need to break up the vertical integration. In automobile industry, vertical integration was necessary because component makers were not out there. You had to make your own components essentially, by and large. That's the starting point of an industry.
Okay. And then,
The classic example of that, I think, was the Ford plant, where you had iron ore and things of that nature going in at one end and cars coming out of the other.
from
end.
iron ore to car. That's
Right.
and you're saying
Ford
that
actually owned rubber plantations in South America in the early years, where they actually got the rubber to produce their own tires, etc. So
Okay.
that's gone away.
so that's and that
As
you're
the
saying
industry
pretty
evolves.
much is when a new market is invented. I think that's important.
When
It's
a
not
new
That's right.
industry is invented.
when a new industry is invented and a
Right.
new market comes by,
Right.
it tends to be vertically.
There's no supply function that they can tap into.
So it's a pretty useless economic model at that point in time, right? It's got almost everything wrong with it. It's inefficient.
Yeah.
It's got excess capacity.
Correct.
It's got low entry barriers. It tends to be vertically integrated. So all the things. Now things begin to change. At what point do they begin to change and how?
Yeah. What happens is that all of a sudden, bunch of people have jumped into the industry. They're trying to clone each other, like the early days of the automobile industry. There were 500 car makers in America alone in early 1900. I just could never imagine 500.
Can you imagine?
By the way, in agricultural equipment, because agriculture was getting mechanized, there were like 250 tractor companies, created at the same time. Each one of them is inefficient. They don't have access to capital anymore. Capital is not coming from the greenfield, cash flow operations. So now shakeout and mergers take place. This is how the shakeout begins in every industry.
This is the consolidation phase.
That's the consolidation phase. And let me just give an example. This is exactly what's happening in India in the cellular industry.
Right.
There are a bunch of players. They cannot sustain on their own anymore. You see the mergers, acquisition, consolidations. You see, for example, Tata on the one hand, Birla on the other hand, AT&T on the third hand, getting together into an idea company. Now we used to call Batata at one time. Well, Bharti has made several acquisitions around here, and now you see the presence of rule of three emerge through shakeout and mergers essentially.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with Island FS Mutual Fund. More than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with Island FS Mutual Fund. More than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.
Young markets. They are highly inefficient, fragmented, with too many players chasing too few customers. Non-uniform technical standards abound. Most companies are vertically integrated, producing almost all their inputs. But in a counter-reaction, 4 key processes drive these young markets towards efficiency. A creation of standards, a sharing of infrastructure, government intervention and corporate consolidation through mergers and acquisitions.
You've actually broken this whole process into, say, 4 key processes,
Right.
which lead, and you've talked about creation of standards, shared infrastructure, government intervention, and that market processes. Well, Jags told us about what's happening in the cellular business. Take us through these 4 key processes and how, if you can relate them to examples from around the world.
Sure. As we talked about earlier, every company that comes in a greenfield industry or a brand new market tends to invent everything for the first time. So they create their own systems, and therefore they're highly inefficient. Now what happens over time, one of the first drivers of efficiency, this new market is growing rapidly, but it's highly inefficient. And so even though the top line growth might be there, the profitability is not
Absolutely.
very high, a lot of excess capacity. So the first real need for that market is to become more efficient, and creating a standard which says that now, instead of there being 50 incompatible products out there, each one made in its own way, so that even an employee going from one company to the other cannot immediately start doing their job. The supplier that one company ultimately starts to do business with cannot do business with any of the other companies because their standards are different.
So now
All of
technical,
that.
who brings about these technical standards?
That's
Typically
an
governments?
Well, it could be a market leader, it could be one of the larger companies that start to, it could be through the industry association. Nowadays I think you start to see that more, where you have the electronics companies, etc. They have various kinds of standards boards where they, even before any product is launched or a new market is created, they know it is in their own interest to identify.
I mean, the
a
best
common
example
standard.
of this one is going to be Wi-Fi. Latest technology. The industry decided you could have multiple standards. It will not create an industry. Why not create a common standard? And they got the IEEE to bless a given common standard. So Wi-Fi is just taking off like crazy right
So
now.
that's the industry coming together
In this case, industry
in
coming
a
together.
platform which
Right.
said this is the standard.
Right.
But we've had so much debate over standards, haven't we? We've got GSM versus CDMA in
Precisely.
cellular, NTSC versus PAL in television, and these debates and conflicts have survived decades.
By the way, this is nothing. The real battles that we studied were the railroads. When the British government or the colonial powers allowed private enterprise to start railroads, some had a narrow gauge, some had a broad gauge, some had a meter gauge. You bring your goods up to this point with this railroad, you have to unload it, put it into another railroad. You could not connect the cars.
Is that right?
Absolutely. So the government finally intervened and simply said, we will either have one standard, broad gauge or whatever it is, or we will build our own railroads essentially.
So
We could
really-
not nationally connect it.
So again, you're saying if industries, once industry becomes critical size, if industry cannot do it, usually governments come in.
Absolutely. Now, let's just go back again to the cellular, which is very key. I just did a Goldman Sachs presentation about 2 years ago, and I've repeated several times. I'm so, in fact, concerned about this issue. Here is a country, US, that invented cellular technology, commercialized it. It's going to lose it permanently because they did not create a single standard. We had the old AMPS, which is the analog standard with which it began. Then we went into TDMA. We allowed GSM. On the other hand, we allowed CDMA. Here is a country, even though its size would have given them the advantage, lost it. Europeans had a single standard from the beginning, GSM.
Asia has had
Asia
virtually
had
one
GSM,
standard,
and
yes.
today, therefore, they went ahead. By the way, we have forecasted there won't be a single service operator of America who will ever become a global player now.
And that's because of the standards
Lack of
confusion.
standards in the beginning.
That's strange, isn't
It's
it?
fascinating. By the way, same thing, my analog here is about the television industry.
Yes.
Television was invented in America, commercialized it, and they lost it. We don't make television sets anymore because each assembler had their own vacuum tubes makers who were highly dedicated. One vacuum cannot fit into somebody else's chassis. We lost the scale economies. So when the solid state came in, Japanese took over this thing, and now it's Korea, eventually will be China.
And that's again a standards battle.
Standards battle, exactly.
Why? I know we are digressing a
Very
bit,
good.
but it's interesting why.
It's the typical problem.
The world's largest economy,
This is what
which has got thought leaders like you,
Exactly.
which write theories
Right.
like this,
Right.
and that country makes that mistake?
This is what I call the curse of the industrial revolution.
Uh-huh.
In the industrial revolution, one of the key incentives governments gave were to give you patent right. Patent right gave you monopoly rents, as the economists will call you, or extraordinary income by and large, or profits that will make.
Right.
You had a tendency to vertically control somehow, And this patent rights as a phenomenon motivated you to somehow keep your standards to yourself. Think about a company that really began the PC revolution called Apple Computers, but they refused to open up their GUI standard to allow to the world, and they became basically a niche player.
In the time that we've left here, I want to talk a bit about the Indian landscape.
Right.
Now, I want to quote to you what you've written. It's a sort of a largish quote, so I'll sort of run through it very quickly. The application of the rule of three to the Indian market is moderated by two significant and persistent factors: the presence of a large unorganized and unbranded sector in many industries,
Correct.
and the presence of many regional players.
Right.
So you're saying it's moderated, i.e., you don't expect the rule of Indian markets to evolve into the rule of three so easily
Correct.
and so quickly
Yes.
as in the rest of the world?
Correct. The unorganized sector was created by design after independence, what's called the small scale sector. Latest statistics, which I just read this morning in many ways, is fascinating to watch. 46% of all the PC made in India is unassembled, basically assembled unbranded product line. It is not even multinational brands or brands like Wipro, for example. On the other hand, is totally unassembled. In luggage, it's about 65%. Those have no incentives to give up their livelihood, because it makes enormous money by not paying proper income taxes. They get all the relief. They get all the incentives to keep them small.
Okay, so these are market inefficiencies, which are therefore going to keep Indian markets away from the rule of three in certain
Yes.
industries?
By government incentives. The key point here is that the government has been proactively promoting that which may be interesting to an individual company but hurting the society as a whole.
By lowering tariffs and taxes in general, you make it less attractive to be in the unorganized sector, number one. Secondly, by allowing consolidation, you increase the economies of scale and therefore the price competitiveness of the large branded companies on the other hand. So over time, there's no reason for a consumer to buy a no-name product without any guarantee behind it and with no assurance of quality, etc. Broaden the definition or the scope of your business to say it's not just the products but also the related services and ancillary activities, which are now the biggest revenue growth areas for companies like IBM and General Electric.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with Island FS Mutual Fund. More than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.